to the graphic nature of this program, listener discretion is advised.
So let's be honest, we all knew where this series was headed. When discussing metal and murder, you inevitably wind up talking about mayhem. And as clickbaity as it may seem to have this as part of my Murdered by Metal series, this video is not about trying to prove that it really was Euronymous in the bedroom with the shotgun. Nor am I going to indulge in any armchair pop psychology analysis and try to hold anyone up as the new poster child for depression, schizophrenia, Cotard's delusion, psychopathy, or whatever other diagnosis people come up with. I'm not going to exploit a person's mental health struggles or a family's grief in order to push my own agenda or awareness campaign. However, I will say, if you are struggling with your mental health, please reach out to someone for help. On screen now are the names and numbers of various organizations from around the world to which you can turn to if you need them. You don't have to struggle alone. Alright, that's my duty of care as a responsible YouTube content creator done. Oh, and FYI, there's a lot of Swedish, Norwegian, and a couple of Turkish place names in this that I know I'm going to wind up horrifically mispronouncing. I apologize in advance for that. I'll put the proper words and spelling up on the screen, but I'm gonna give it a shot, see what happens, see how it works out.
Parlay. Down to the depths, whatever mutton they thought of parlay. That would be the French.
Please don't hurt me. I'm doing my best.
Your best. Losers always whine about their best.
Are you sitting comfortably? I hope so, because we've got a lot to get through. So, let's begin. It was a chillier than average day in the small town of Västerhaninge, Sweden, when Anita Forsberg gave birth to her first child with husband Lars Ohlin on the 16th of January 1969. The young couple named their son Per Yngve Ohlin, and he was the first of 3 beloved children who would be born to Anita and Lars, followed by a brother named Anders and a sister named Anne. Affectionately referred to as Pella, the boy very quickly developed a personality based in unpredictability. A favorite family story illustrating this tells how, as a child, he became a member of Flautbiologerna, the nature and youth organization of Sweden, which instilled in him a love for nature that followed Pella into adulthood. While traveling on a train one day, a young Pella pointed accusingly at a lady wearing a leopard coat and demanded to know if it was real or fake. The woman blushed but didn't answer, so Pella raised his voice, again asking, "Is it real or fake?"
Why, you little...
This stubborn tenacity mixed with his unpredictability did not endear Pella to the parents of other children, and he was often blamed for their mischief. His father recalled a day when Pella had gone to visit one of his best friends, but came home much earlier than expected. Pella told his father that the boy's mother had said to him, "Well, Pella, you'll have to go home now because it's time for Frederick's birthday party." While the young Pella didn't seem particularly upset at the thought of not being invited to a friend's birthday party, and instead spent the day building Lego, his father thought it was incredibly tough on the boy to exclude him. Per was also known to be incredibly honest. The family used to say that Per couldn't lie. He was totally hopeless when you told him a secret, because 5 minutes later he would sit and tell his mother. In Anders' eyes, that was a worthless feature in a big brother. As the years passed, Per developed an interest in horror movies, comic books, and drawing, and began drawing his own comic strips. He started out drawing animals, then moved on to war-inspired scenes before finally graduating to horror, but they were always written with a certain humorous slant, albeit very dark humor. He would send his drawings to various fanzines around the world and spent most of his spare time creating these drawings on whatever materials came his way, including drawing all over the insides of his bedroom drawers. The interest in music was slower to begin with, but by the early 80s, as metal became more popular, Per and younger brother Anders read about and listened to Judas Priest, Iron Maiden, Slayer, Wasp, Kiss, AC/DC, and of course, Black Sabbath. Aussie era only. Per didn't like Dio. I know, it was a shock to me too. It really changed my whole view of Per. He did say he liked Holy Diver, but that was it. Everything else was Aussie Black Sabbath era only.
This man is overgasped!
But though Anders was eventually able to get Per to appreciate Metallica, Per found himself drawn towards darker bands like Venom, Sodom, and Merciful Fate. Upon discovering Bathory, Per was euphoric at the thought that not only was a new band following and building on Venom's style, but that it was a Swedish band to boot. One day in the mid-80s, when Anders was enjoying his first romantic relationship, he was hanging out at his girlfriend's house and saw her sister had a record with a cover that drew his interest. He begged her to let him borrow it, but she was hesitant as she had borrowed it from a friend who was, in Anders' words, a totally crazy dude, and she didn't like to think of what this dude would have done to her if she'd loaned it to him. However, after much begging and wheedling from Anders, who explained just how much it would mean to him and Per, she reluctantly agreed when Anders promised he'd return it that very evening. No sooner had she agreed than Anders jumped on his bike and pedaled fast for home. The instant Per saw the cover, his eyes almost popped out of his head. The two brothers excitedly ran for the record player, only for their mother to suddenly appear. She sternly reminded the boys that they were banned from using the record player, though exactly why has kind of been lost to history. Hoping to sway her, the boys quickly began to explain that this was an extreme record which they'd borrowed for the day and promised to return as quickly as possible, but their mother refused to budge. Thus began the negotiations until their mother finally agreed they could copy the record onto a cassette tape so long as they did so without turning up the volume and listening to the album as it recorded. So the two boys stood and watched as the needle moved across the record, excitedly listening to every hiss and crackle, eagerly anticipating when they could listen to the tape, which Per later did, while Anders cycled back to return the album in the pouring rain. That album was Sentence of Death by Destruction. Sadly, these idyllic years of happy home began to end as Pelle entered his teen years and his parents decided to divorce. This was a change Pelle had difficulty accepting and adjusting to. He lived with his father for 2 months, then refused to move in with his mother until he was forced to. So it went back and forth. Firmly ensconced with one parent, he refused to leave to stay with the other. He came and went like a cat would, the worst affected of all the Ohlin children. His parents' relationship was so bad they wouldn't even talk to each other, let alone be in the same room together. While his family life was falling apart, so too was his school life. All throughout his primary school years, Per's class had been a close-knit group of friends. Whenever someone had a birthday, the entire class would be invited to the party. But when he changed schools and began 7th grade at Rybeskola, the group was split up, and he was faced with a whole new group of people, none of whom understood who he was or had patience with his idiosyncrasies, and so Per found himself being completely ostracized. In the words of Anders, Big Brother went from being a happy salmon to being depressed. Per was heavily bullied and regularly beaten up, until one day in 1982 at the age of 13, when his bullies took their attacks too far. Per came back to his father's house one day looking pale and sweaty. When asked by his stepmother what was wrong, he didn't answer. He just stumbled to his room, banging his head on the doorframe. He puked and then lay down on his bed to sleep it off. When his stepmother went to check in on him, she found him unconscious and without a pulse. Luckily, she was a nurse, and recognizing that he was in a bad way, she called for an ambulance and began to perform CPR. Per was rushed to the hospital, but doctors weren't entirely sure what was wrong with him, so they were forced to begin exploratory surgery. They made an incision on his side and discovered that his spleen had ruptured. This near-death experience is probably the most commonly known thing about Per, and after repeatedly reading and hearing about it while researching this video, I began to wonder, what the fuck does the spleen do anyway? So, we interrupt this episode of Murdered by Metal with a segment I like to call, What the fuck is the spleen for anyway?
If you don't know what the spleen does, by the way, it filters your blood and it helps in the fight against nasty bacteria. It's kind of like the organ equivalent of a nightclub bouncer. You don't really need it, and no one really likes it, but if it's not there, someone's gonna get their dick out on the dance floor.
One quick splenectomy later, seriously, that's what it's called, and Per was A-okay, at least physically. The experience of being clinically dead for several minutes was one which came to have a massive impact on how he saw the world and his place in it. Per suddenly became interested in stories about near-death experiences, searching for and amassing a personal library of books that spoke on the subject and shared other people's stories and experiences. It is from his own words that we are given an insight into what exactly it was Per experienced during that time while he had no pulse. He wrote in a letter to a friend and went into detail about what he remembered. I had a weird experience once. I had inner bleedings and it couldn't be found on x-rays, so when it continued to bleed and bleed, I finally fainted and dropped down to the floor because I ran out of blood. The heart had no blood left to beat and my veins and arteries were almost emptied of blood. Technically, I was dead. At that moment when I fell down into a door I heard later, I saw a strange blue color everywhere. It was transparent, so I could for a short moment see everything in blue, till something shining white and hot surrounded me. What happened later is out of interest. I woke up when some ambulance men came and drove me to a new hospital, and there the bastards of surgery started to cut me up at the wrong side, so I got a huge scar from that. However, it's someone I know who's had many out-of-body experiences in using magic of various kinds, and knows much more than I do of supernatural experiences, that I asked of this because it was so strange about those colors. She told me that the first plane in the astral world has the color blue. The earthly plane has the color black. Then comes a gray one that is very near the earthly one and is easy to come to. The next one further is blue, then it gets brighter and brighter till it stops at a white shining one that can't be reached by mortals. If any mortal enter it, that one is no longer a mortal and cannot come back to the other planes nor back to this earth. After the white plane or level or whatever, it goes further with other colors that I don't know of. There only spirits and great sorcerers can travel. I was told that the white plane I then entered, without knowing it, was the dead world, and I died. But I also got thrown back after a short time, which very rarely happens. So what I've learned of, I have some kind of purpose to achieve here. That happened almost 8 years ago, and I am trying to find out what I have to do here before I can enter the light again. At first, Per told his parents that he had slipped on a patch of ice outside the school and happened to hit himself in the stomach with his elbow hard. Like really hard. Like, just super hard. Yeah, totally. Yeah. His parents didn't believe him, and eventually they learned the truth about the beatings. They confronted the principal, who denied that Per had been exposed to any bullying and refused to punish those responsible. After many conversations with various counselors, it was decided that halfway through the autumn term in 7th grade, Per would leave Rybaskola and begin attending Tangelska school instead. When telling others this story in later life, Per would often lie about the cause of his injury, telling some people he had eaten poisonous mushrooms, others that he'd slipped on some ice while skating, and someone's skate had cut into him. It was this skating story, related by friend Jon Neklerbutcher Stuberlund in the documentary Pure Fucking Mayhem, which became what everyone believed for a very long time. It wasn't until years later when, in an interview with his brother Anders, the truth was finally told. Per didn't really link being bullied with his personality. If someone had a problem with him, that was their problem, and there wasn't anything he could do about it. Per began to get incredibly scared and paranoid, taking up Aikido and watching kung fu movies. His interest in music and horror started to take up more of his time, with his fascination for the morbid becoming deeper and deeper. He collected Romanian postage stamps and dreamed of traveling beyond Scandinavia. He wished to travel to Transylvania and Moldavia to learn everything of the legends there that are rarely known of in the West. His interest in war, which he'd had since a child, began to occupy his mind more often, and Per searched for volunteer officer training in the expectation he would be taught how to shoot machine guns. But standing and being shouted at by officers quickly palled, and after one whole day of very boring orientation, Per decided that a military life was not for him after all. Despite his concerns, Per quickly began to make new friends at his school, where he found a bunch of like-minded people who shared his interest in music. Per started to let his hair grow long and hanging out at Heavy Sound, Stockholm's hub for the growing local death metal scene. With his improved mood and new friendships, Per was able to begin the next phase of his life. He surprised the whole family one day when he came home and announced that he'd joined a band. The family found this announcement rather astonishing, especially as they all knew that Per didn't play any instruments and knew absolutely nothing about music theory. He did eventually buy a guitar, but spent more of his time drawing on it than actually playing it. Apparently this guitar still graces his mother's living room to this day. When Anders asked him what role he would be taking in the band, Per proudly replied he would be the vocalist. Which makes a change. Usually a musical one ends up as the bassist or the drummer. Deciding to call the group Ohlin Metal, Per set to work on the first step, letting the public know that the band existed. His chosen form of promotion was to spray paint the band's name all over the town, including the train station and his former school. Did I mention the band was called Ohlin Metal? So you can imagine the reaction from Per's father when, at the train station one morning, he saw the graffiti and somehow, magically, probably using some kind of secret parental powers, immediately knew that it was his son's handiwork. One afternoon while hanging out at Heavy Sound, Per noticed a flyer pinned on the community notice board from a band named Armageddon in Akersburg. The ad said they were looking for a singer and a bassist, listing Slayer as one of their influences. Per called the number, and that was how he met guitarist John Hagstrom and drummer Sandro Koyander. With this new group formed, they changed their name to Scapegoat, a name from which Per took his new nickname Goat. He began to be known as Hornper, and everyone in town knew him as he was the only one who drove a black moped with a pentagram painted on it. Per had a clear idea of where he wanted the band to go, steering them with his determination, but his high standards made it difficult for Scapegoat to really take off. So he and John Hagstrom decided to scrap Scapegoat and begin a new project, which they named Morbid. Morbid would be heavier than Scapegoat had been, and darker. Through yet another flyer at Heavy Sound, Per met and befriended L.G. Petrov, who became their drummer after Sandro Koyander left the group. And in the summer of 1986, at a concert in... really sorry about this... Kungsträskegarten, Per met and recruited Jens Nastrom as their bassist. A short time later, they also added Uffe Sendelund as an extra guitarist. It was here where Per's innate penchant for perfection was demonstrated. He insisted on the group practicing 3 times a week and knowing the songs note perfect. Anytime someone made a mistake, he would insist that the whole group start the entire song over again from the beginning and play it through about 10 more times. Jens and Per would skip going to school and instead spend their time at Jens's place in Fridhemsplan, uniting their theatrical ambitions with their interest in dark subjects to create a stage atmosphere that would be unique to them. They created alter egos, and it is around this time that Per began some of the performance habits for which he is still known and praised for to this day. Per had already started to refer to himself as dead. Now he began using corpse paint, not to look scary and intimidating, but because he wanted to cultivate a look reminiscent of the corpse of a 13th century plague victim. Oddly specific, but okay. He also created his infamous obituary shirt at this time, a black shirt onto which he would pin obituaries that he'd cut out of the local paper, which may have caused him a few awkward interactions when you think about it. Jens took the name Dr. Schitz. Schitz. Shit, it's German, okay? It's not... Okay, that's probably the point of using that name, but moving on. Jens took the name Dr. Schitz and was seen on stage at Morbid's first live show at Ultra Hall in April 1987 wearing a doctor's coat and with an IV pole. They'd also hired a smoke machine for the show, but no one knew how to use it. Someone at the venue just stood there and kept holding down the button until the whole stage was covered in fog and no one could see anything. But this lack of visibility didn't deter the band or the audience from continuing to headbang through the entire set. A month later, on May 29th, Per had an opportunity to meet with one of his personal metal gods, the creator of the black metal band Bathory and Swedish sensation Quorthon. Quorthon was set to visit Heavy Sound to sign copies of Bathory's third album, Under the Sign of the Black Mark. All the boys from Morbid turned out, excited and expectant, eager to see the man who dragged metal into a new, darker direction. You know that saying, never meet your heroes? Quorthon came sauntering in, wearing sunglasses, dressed in a leather jacket, and looking way too much like a rock star, smiling and giving people thumbs up. This was their metal god. This sorry excuse for an Yngve Malmsteen ripoff. To say Per was disappointed would be something of an understatement.
I'd like to tell him I'm disappointed in his work. I'm disappointed in your work.
Thank you, that's the nicest thing you've ever said to me!
In fact, Per was so upset, he decided to send Quorthon a letter telling him so. One which would contain a very special gift. Hanging out with several friends at Jens's house one day, the group got to wondering where Per had gone to. They found him in the basement, with a hamster. And a scalpel. Per killed the small animal, chopping at it, saying he would put it on a cross and mail it to Quorthon, an idea he would later recycle when sending a letter to a certain group in Norway. He decapitated the hamster and nailed its head to an inverted cross, hammering spikes into its eyes. He and Jens then visited Elektra Studios with their special present in a plastic bag, accompanied with a copy of their rehearsal tape. They gave the package to the receptionist, requesting she pass it on to Ace Forsberg of Bathory. A few days later, they called the head of the company, no pun intended, Borgi, to see if he'd received it. Borgi said he liked the band, but was less keen on the present, saying they'd taken the whole thing too far and calling them the sickest people he had ever met. This disheartening experience caused Per to eviscerate Quorthon. Poor choice of words there again. I was speaking metaphorically. In every future interview he gave, claiming Quorthon was a poser and no better than bands like Mephisto. In an interview with Battery magazine, Per said that Quorthon was one of the worst motherfucking wimps I've had the misfortune to meet. Per was something of a purist when it came to metal, especially black metal. He felt that it was alright, fine, he was a gatekeeper. Believed that metalheads should listen to metal and only true metal, which consisted of bands that weren't interested in commercial fame and or fortune. After Quorthon turned out to be such a disappointment, Per began to turn his attention to Norway and what bands the neighboring country could offer him. This was the moment when Per began to pay closer attention to the Norwegian black metal band Mayhem. Morbid played several more times in 1987, and it was in these live shows where the band really shone. Per's aesthetic for the stage design was to be as dark and death-like as possible. During a gig at Birkegarden, in a youth centre at Vastastan, Morbid decorated their stage with candles and a coffin that they had excavated late at night from the local grave. Just kidding. It was borrowed from the props department of SVT, Sweden's public state-controlled TV broadcaster, where Uffe's father worked. Per recorded the intro from Yngve Dead, which he played on repeat as he crawled out of the coffin. Smoke machines at full power. I guess they didn't learn from their first gig. Towards the end of 1987, on December 5th and 6th, Morbid went into Thunderlode Studios to record a demo album which they titled December Moon. The tracklist features the songs My Dark Subconscious, Wings of Funeral, From the Dark, and Disgusting Semla. The cover consisted of a logo that was designed by Pella and which I'm sure is a complete homage to Hammer horror films and nothing more. With the phrase In nomine de nostri Satanas Luciferi Excelsi written along the bottom. The entire demo had a length of 17 minutes and 45 seconds. Per and John would make copies of the tape and cover, delivering 15 to 20 tapes to Heavy Sound every week, and it was at this point that Per's membership as part of the tape trading community really began to pay off. For years, Per had been a prolific epistolatory communicator, writing to bands and friends all around the world. This underground community was huge during the 80s and 90s, where people would trade demos and albums, spreading the word of different bands to fans and communities all over the world. I was lucky enough to just get on the end of this very important moment in heavy metal history in the late 90s, before CDs, online streaming, and goddamn-it, Napster rendered cassette tapes obsolete. All the letters Per sent were written by hand as he eschewed modern technology. Believe it or not, there was a time when an electric typewriter was the height of home-based communicative technology. He wrote in a letter to one friend, "The worst thing about modern time is the modern way of thinking, and there is too much to explain." Per believed technology had caused humanity to become disconnected from nature. After selling several hundred copies of the demo, Morbid seemed to be geared to begin a long and successful career. However, things weren't so hunky-dory. Per was feeling frustrated as the band's songs were more light-hearted than he'd wanted. A big thorn in Per's side was the song Disgusting Semla.
Beans are on the what now?
It's a small bun flavored with cardamom and filled with almond paste and whipped cream or pudding. Morbid would take them to gigs and throw them into the crowd. There the semla made a huge mess, which caused people to trip and fall and was probably absolutely hilarious to see from the main stage. But Per's philosophy was be evil, not open-minded. He desired a challenge, one that was even more serious and extreme than Morbid was turning out to be. As well as these problems, Jon Hagström decided to leave Morbid in 1988 to get a job in the telecom industry. This was a harsh blow for Per. He saw it as a kind of defection, thinking it inconceivable to have other priorities than the band. As a co-writer, Jon had been a musical anchor for Per, and after Jon left Morbid, Per flailed for a while, trying to figure out what to do. He had a brief cameo in the music video for the song Bewitched by the Swedish group Candlemass.
My fingers, they dance upon the strings like fire, weaving a spell of my burning desire.
Directed by Jonas Åkerlund, former drummer for Bathory and future director of the infamous Lords of Chaos movie. And don't worry, I'll be talking about that movie in another video. Oh, yes. But as much fun as zombie doom stomping in the background of a music video is, it's not exactly a sustainable career. So Per was again left with the question,
Now what?
As a point of interest, Jens Näsström also eventually left Morbid, and he went on to become a psychologist. The seeds of his next step had already been planted all those weeks ago when Per became interested in Mayhem and cultivated a correspondence with them by letter and phone. The details of how Per came to learn about Mayhem's need for a vocalist are a little inconsistent. One story states that Per saw a flyer in a shop in Sweden where Mayhem were advertising for a vocalist. Another story tells that Metallion, the creator and editor of Slayer Mag, recommended him to Mayhem's guitarist Euronymous, and yet a third story claims that it was mentioned during a phone conversation between Per and Euronymous. Whatever way he learned about the position, the tale of Per's application has certainly gone down in black metal history and mythos. I'll let the bassist Necrobutcher tell it in his own words.
Vi hadde et postboks på Langhus postkontor, boks 75. I og med at jeg bodde på Langhus, så var det en av jobbene mine å tømme den postboksen. Så var det en dag jeg kom opp der, og det lå en pakke der. Og jeg åpnet opp pakka, og det bare kom en sånn råtten... Det lukta helt jævlig. Og når jeg kikket opp i brevet, så ser jeg at det er en mus som korsfestet på 2 pinner. Som ligger oppe i brevet der, og en kassett. Og jeg smukket på den i kassespilleren, og det var den demoen som het December Moon. Fra et band som het Morbid. Han har fått informasjon om at vi trengte vokalist, og han lurte på om han kunne komme og prøvesynge for oss, basically.
Naturally, his family were a little taken aback by Per's sudden decision to relocate.
What the fuck is he doing?
While they knew Morbid wasn't working out as Per had hoped, they really had no idea that he was considering such a move until one night when he showed them Mayhem's LP Death Crush and announced that he was going to Norway to take over the role of lead vocalist. While I didn't really agree with his decision and were concerned for his future, Per's parents were somewhat mollified by the existence of the LP and how well it had sold, believing that indicated Mayhem had a chance of being a better success than Morbid had. So it came to pass that a few weeks after John Hagstrom left Morbid, Per was seated on a plane headed for Oslo, taking with him all that a black metal head needs: his clothes, a few books, plastic spiders, and several capsules of fake blood. Ah, for those days when you could take just about any kind of crap on an airplane. He was greeted at Fornebu Airport by Mayhem members Johan Necrobutcher Stubrund and Øystein Euronymous Arseth, where they encountered their first main obstacle. Per didn't speak Norwegian. Necrobutcher and Euronymous didn't speak Swedish. So, as is the habit of most Europeans, they spoke to each other in English. This caused Necrobutcher some concern, as he believed communication to be one of the most important aspects of a band's dynamic, and Euronymous' English in particular was spoken with an odd accent that made it difficult for Per to understand him at times.
Good day to you.
Waving the problem away and demonstrating his ability to easily dismiss what most people would consider a glaring problem, Euronymous quickly began organizing a photo shoot for the trio using the blood capsules Per had brought with him. Necrobutcher quickly befriended Per, sharing his interests in film, comics, and very dark humor. Euronymous was fascinated with all of Per's idiosyncrasies, believing them to be part of Per's image as dead. Euronymous assumed everything Per did and said was all part of cultivating his dead persona when in the presence of others, and that in the privacy of his own mind, Per wasn't as dark as he presented himself. This fundamental understanding would lead to a very tense relationship between the two, with disastrous consequences. Mayhem's drummer, Torben Gru, however, did not find Per's interests appealing or his idiosyncrasies intriguing. When Torben once called him Pella, he received the quick reply, "My name is not Pella, my name is Dead." As a young 14-year-old who saw mayhem and black metal as something fun and silly which he struggled to take seriously, Torben was deeply disturbed by Per's talk about lying in a coffin, attempting to get bed sores, and starving himself in order to appear more corpse-like. Torben came to the conclusion that this was not something with which he wanted to be associated, and so he left the band. He has since gone on to have a successful career as an opera singer, so well done, Torben. Torben's exit allowed for the entrance of one Jan Axel Hellhammer Blomberg, and the classic Mayhem lineup was complete. Necrobutcher on bass, Hellhammer on drums, Per on vocals, and Euronymous on guitar. Their rehearsal room was also one of Per's crash pads, the henhouse on Necrobutcher's family farm outside Vestby. Shortly after his arrival in Norway, Per's father flew over to check on him and see how he was doing. Once reassured that his son was making friends and staying in relative comfort, he offered the band his old car. This trip to Sweden to pick up the car and drive it back to Norway marks the first and only time Per's brother Anders ever met Euronymous.
Why, you little...
In Norway, Per immediately got to work on creating new material with the band. He shared with them his song Freezing Moon, which he'd originally written as a song for Morbid and had brought with him to Norway. This has become Mayhem's most iconic and well-known track, and is one of only 2 songs recorded in studio by Mayhem, which features Per's vocals. The group entered creative studios in Kolbotn to lay down the tracks for 2 songs, Freezing Moon and Carnage. They were intended for a Swedish compilation album called Projections of a Stained Mind, which featured new extreme metal and had been organized by Jens Nastrom. The band were joined in the studio by Sven-Erik Maniac Christiansen, who had contributed vocals to the Death Crush EP. Per asked him to keep hold of a paper bag he'd brought to the studio, from which he would take a deep breath before beginning to sing. When Maniac looked inside the bag, he found it held the remains of several dead crows. Per would breathe the air from this bag between each verse he recorded. Per had a habit of collecting roadkill, some of which he'd freeze or keep under his bed. He continued this habit of huffing death for live shows as well. A process became a kind of ritual where he would save the dead. Still, better to huff the dead than to be huffing petrol, huffing glue, or huffing paint.
Old painty can Ned.
Mayhem arranged a gig in Poland set for December 1989. 2 days before the date, they was talking to one of the other bands that was also booked for this same date, and discovered that the organizer of the event was a complete and utter fraud. So, kind of put some crimps in that plan. Meanwhile, Per's living situation was also becoming complicated. He would crash at both Necrobutcher and Euronymous' homes, but couldn't stay in either permanently. While his fellow Mayhem members had plenty of alternative accommodation options, such as family and friends, Per had no such network in the area. He lived in the car for a while, then moved into a partially burnt-down youth club, which was also occupied by drunks. 1 year after spending Christmas in Sweden, he returned back to the shack to find all his comic books had been stolen. I mean, what kind of a world were we living in where you couldn't even trust a bunch of drunks to not steal your comic books? That's just low, guys. That's low. Hellhammer kept him company one summer when he holed up in a seemingly abandoned property in the woods, only for them to be evicted in autumn when the owner showed up one day and threatened them with a shotgun. Which in hindsight I can't help but look at as a tantalizing hint of terrible things to come. But I'm a sick bastard that way. Per's father withdrew his financial assistance of his son's Norwegian life when he discovered that Per was using the money he'd been sent for groceries to help Mayhem send letters and tapes. Per actually could just skip eating, just to be able to send a cassette tape to someone or be able to arrange a gig somewhere. A more stable accommodation was achieved when Necrobutcher helped Per obtain welfare from the Norwegian government, who housed him in a motel that was nestled on a camping site called Bevedalen. He stayed there until sometime in 1990, when Euronymous managed to arrange for himself, Hellhammer, and Per to move into a property owned by the parents of one of his old school friends in the town of Krokstad Ski. This was a perfect location for the band as it backed onto woodlands and had many rooms and buildings, including a gym. This meant that they could live and rehearse in the same space without too many complaints from the neighbors. Per chose to spend New Year's Eve 1989 in Norway at a party held at the house of Metallion. There he met up with longtime correspondent and friend Thomas Lindberg, frontman for the band Grotesque. Pelle and Thompa together were known for creating chaos.
We are lords of chaos.
And that night was no different. They sat in Metallion's parents' bedroom, cutting themselves with knives and drinking his mother's champagne.
You want the rest of the champagne?
They were engaged in an intense discussion, and Pelle suddenly said, "We're going to Transylvania tonight, you and me, Thompa." Thompa said he remembered thinking, "No, I don't think we'll be doing that this evening." Pelle became so fixated on the idea of undertaking a great journey together that Thompa ended up hiding in Metallion's bedroom for the night. A knife-wielding Pelle tipped over a full table of beer bottles in the living room and tried to smash the big window facing the garden. He had to be tackled and restrained with handcuffs by Euronymous, Metallion, and René Jansson of Cadaver. When Pelle finally fell asleep, Euronymous stayed in the room with him, sleeping on the floor in order to keep an eye on his vocalist. The group of partygoers ended up having to take Per to the police station in order to have the cuffs removed because the key had been misplaced. Mayhem and keys is going to be somewhat of a recurring theme in the history of this particular lineup. Per claimed to retain no memory of the wild evening. The two had made a terrible mess in the bedroom, and Metallion was forced to throw out everything he could find that had a blood stain on it. Personally, I think I'd have been more pissed off that they drank all my champagne rather than they bled all over everything. Per was not a drinker nor a smoker, so on those rare occasions when he did drink, he stuck to a type of beer known as Folgul, which means it has an alcoholic content between 2.25 and 3.5%.
It's a little like making love in a canoe.
Making love in a canoe?
It's fucking close to water.
Whenever he tried anything stronger, he'd behave like a typical first-time drunk. He would also chew on snus, a type of smokeless tobacco from Sweden, instead of smoking it. Finally, after 2 long years of rehearsals, Mayhem were ready to give their first concerts featuring Pelle and Hellhammer. This was the year they believed was really going to make Mayhem, as they had an entire concert tour planned across various countries around Europe. Thanks to the affordability, read cheapness, of Interrail train tickets, the band planned shows in Germany, Greece, Turkey, and Holland. And, like much of their history, there's a bunch of misinformation and confusion regarding this tour concerning where and when the band played. Mayhem began by playing a few gigs in Norway during February of 1990. This allowed them to get a sense of their onstage dynamic and iron out any potential kinks in their live performances. The first ever show featuring the classic Mayhem lineup took place at Folkets Hus in the town of Jessheim, Norway, on February 3, 1990. They decorated the stage with several rotting pig heads, which they would later throw into the audience during their set. Once again donning his iconic corpse paint, Pelle added a new touch to his stage outfit by burying his clothes for several days before the gig, allowing them to rot. When he dug them up, he didn't bother with washing them, but rather just put them on, dirt and all. The only concession he made to this macabre fashion choice was to ensure that he wore plain black leggings underneath, because if he hadn't, well, just take a look at the photo and note the placement of several of the holes. Shyness or modesty, you decide. Maybe he just didn't want to distract people from the show of death being played out before them. Huh?
Yeah, I'm not proud of that.
As well as rotting clothes and pig heads, Pelle wanted to add an air of red mist to the night's proceedings, and decided that the best way to achieve this would be to cut himself live on stage. This was an idea that Necrobutcher was not as keen on, and he made a point of giving Pelle a pair of knives that were fairly blunt. This didn't allow Pelle to make the deep cuts he really wanted, so he grabbed a Coca-Cola bottle from the stage, likely belonging to Euronymous Dude, single-handedly kept the Norwegian Coke market in the black. It's really rather appropriate when you think about it. Smashed the bottle and began slashing at his arms. Pelle wound up with so many and such deep cuts that halfway through the set he was pulled off stage, bound up with duct tape, and then shoved back on to finish the set. Ah, duct tape. Is there anything it can't do? Euronymous thought the whole performance was a great gag and excitedly talked about how Pelle could next harm himself on stage, the two discussing getting a hold of a chainsaw at one point. Pelle commented on his stage cutting in an interview with Slayer Mag, stating, "Something I study is how people react when my blood is streaming everywhere, but that's not why I do it. That I can't do it too often makes me a bit sad." While Necrobutcher acknowledged the effect it had had on the audience, unlike Euronymous, he didn't think this effect was worth the cost of Pelle's health. This would not be the last time the two had a disagreement over publicly exploiting Pelle's tendency towards self-harm. The evening's set list featured the songs Death Crush, Necrolust, Funeral Fog, Freezing Moon, Carnage, Buried by Time and Dust, Chainsaw Guts Fuck, and Pure Fucking Armageddon. This set list remained pretty much unchanged during the whole tour, mainly due to Mayhem not actually having that many songs written at that time. Mayhem made a point of recording their concerts onto cassette tape, with many of these tapes ending up as heavily sought-after bootlegs by ardent fans who wished to experience the magic of this, the band's most famous lineup. The Jessheim concert bootleg was officially released in 2004 as The Great War and featured an 8-page booklet with photos and interviews. The quality of the bootleg is, like many bootlegs, pretty terrible and constantly criticized for its muddy sound and many signal breaks. Remember, people, these are bootlegs recorded with the most basic of equipment. They aren't proper concert recordings with carefully calibrated mics and channels running through a mixing board. I really don't understand how people can complain about, oh, the quality is so shitty and terrible, why does this exist when it's so terrible? Except to just assume that these complaints are made by the young and or ignorant who are either so used to carrying a phone with a comparatively decent quality camera and mic in their pocket they have no idea what technology was like before it was pocket-sized, or that they know nothing about how music recording works and just assume any and every recording made by a band of a live concert is going to be perfectly calibrated to that band and their equipment. Spoiler alert, this is the exception and not the rule. Why else do you think bands always make a big deal when they release an official live album? Rant over. Sorry. Back to the video. Mayhem's second concert occurred a few weeks later on February 28, 1990, in the town of Sarpsborg, Norway, at a venue called Forheim. This concert was organized by Metallian as a way to raise funds to help pay for the costs of printing Slayer Mag. Mayhem shared the bill with the bands Equinox, Cadaver, So Much Hate, and Buttocks.
He has a wife, you know. You know what she's called? She's called Incontinentia. Incontinentia buttocks. Shut up! What's all this? I've had enough of this rowdy, rebel, sniggering behavior.
Since this was a night for fundraising, and as Metallian knew many of the various members of the bands personally, Cadaver and Buttocks played for free, Equinox were paid with the universal currency that is, a case of beer, and Mayhem and So Much Hate received, quote, $50 each, end quote. So Much Hate were a late addition to the evening, so much so that by the time they confirmed their appearance, Metallian had already printed up the flyers advertising the show, meaning he had to hand-draw their logo onto each poster. Luckily, he'd only printed a few and didn't have to hand-number as many flyers as Euronymous had copies of Death Crush. Even the guy running the soundboard for the night agreed to work for free. Ketil Kallen Johansson had a small studio in his basement which he would rent out to local bands. It was in this basement that Cadaver recorded their first album, Hallucinating Anxiety. Ketil was incredibly supportive of the local music scene, so he was more than happy to lend his expertise for the night. The event was held during some sort of holiday, and a lot of people who otherwise might have passed on the event turned up, likely simply just looking for something to do. But what sets this show apart from most of Mayhem's concerts during 1990 is just how smoothly everything went. Metallian had no experience creating or running such an event, so he leaned hard on the people involved to help him out. There was no bar at the venue, so people brought their own refreshment, and any underage drinkers were ignored, so long as they made sure to share their smuggled booze with Metallian and the performing bands. There was also no security on hand to glower at the crowd and intimidate everyone into behaving, but luckily, none were needed. The door was handled by a few of Metallian's friends, taking cash payments from everyone who showed up, and Metallian hadn't even bothered to check to see if he needed a permit in order to host the gig. Once again, Mayhem recorded the evening, and unlike its predecessor, the recording of this night's entertainment eventually had 300 copies officially pressed onto vinyl and released in 1995 under the title Dawn of the Black Hearts, which we'll be getting more into in a little while. Metallian claims he can't remember what he did that night, though he did make a point to apologize to the innocent bystander I stage dive on during So Much Hate. That guy must have been in a lot of pain in the day or days after. Sorry. While the gig itself may have been a stock standard evening, the after party more than made up for that lack, and was somewhat unique as it lasted for a few days. Traditionally, the after party is held, after the gig, and usually it's just an hour or two designed to allow the band to chillax and revel in the triumph of a successful evening. But it was during these after-party events that Pear's vendetta against hamsters once again reared its head. Seriously, man, what hamster hurt you? Here's the story in Metallian's words. The after-party was at a friend's house, and maybe the most memorable thing was when Dead found my friend's guinea pig. First, he tried to drown it in a jar of herring. When that didn't work, he put the guinea pig and the jar in the microwave. The sound of his screaming was terrible. Later, the woman who lived there was running around screaming, "Who killed my guinea pig?" Dead commented, "I really thought it was a hamster." Dude, seriously, what small rodent pet hurt you? I know people like to repeat that Pella hated cats, but being as he's now killed 2 hamsters, and I've not found a single report of him ever managing to murder a cat, I'm starting to wonder about just what the hell kind of traumatic event could have possibly have occurred which would have sparked such vindictiveness against such a tiny animal. Seriously, it's weird. Metallian claims he made about $200 from the evening, but that when he looks back on the night, he doesn't think about how much money he made, but rather how, when we are living in the moment, you don't really look forward or backwards. You are just there. Surely enough, I thought I would see Mayhem 1,000,000 times more, but that was not to be. So trying to explain the feelings now as opposed to then is very hard, because you know how legendary it became, but it was not back then, so thinking rationally about the whole musical experience now is close to impossible. Several months later, at the end of November, Mayhem set off to ride the rails across the length and breadth of Europe on a wild, 1-month-long tour. This tour kicked off in East Germany and had been organized by one Albo Alsleben, who had been warned about what to expect from their live shows in a letter from Euronymous. In case one or more gigs are very brutal, Dead will probably cut himself. Do you think you can find a knife which is big and looks very brutal? A kitchen knife is quite good. Another thing is that Dead is insured so that he doesn't have to pay the hospital bills himself, but he won't get money if they find out that he has cut himself. So we must be prepared to tell the hospital that we were at a party where some people started to beat up people. We can blame Nazi skinheads. It's also important that in case Dead cuts too deep, we must have the possibility to bring him to the hospital fast. Oddly, despite the fame, or infamy, of this tour, the first show Mayhem played in East Germany has been almost forgotten. The group played a gig in the town of Annaberg-Buchholz on November 23rd. Given that no recording of this night has ever been released, officially or otherwise, that's likely why it tends to be forgotten and or overlooked when fans discuss the wild events of these shows. It's so obscure I was unable to find so much as the name of the venue in which they played. Indeed, even in interviews with the concert organizer, the Annaberg concert is mentioned really only in passing. The group played their second gig at an unknown venue in the East German town of Zeitz. This concert, recorded onto tape, was copied and spread by Pella, who hand-drew the covers and sent them to close friends, with 1,000 copies being officially pressed and released on vinyl in August 2016. Their third gig was at the Eiskeller Club in the German town of Leipzig on November 26, 1990. The entire band were pretty much over the whole experience by now, with all of them having encountered breathing troubles due to the horrific air quality. Most homes in the former German Democratic Republic, now there's a country propaganda name on par with the People's Republic of China, were heated by burning coal stoves, making the air thick, heavy, and polluted. Add that to the general fog and gloom of Germany in winter, and it's easy to see why the whole endeavor may have felt somewhat depressing. When listening back to the recording made of the concert the next day, the band decided not to release the bootleg as they believed they were capable of creating a better quality recording. And yet, this tape also eventually being released on vinyl in 1993 and gaining a re-release in 2015, which marks the 25th anniversary of the concert. Despite the recent unification of East and West Germany, there was a pervading air of distrust and suspicion, especially for people wandering around in leather jackets with long hair. And most extreme nationalist groups, aka Nazis, didn't bother to differentiate between metalheads and punks. Both were fair game in their eyes. So, while Pella made a point to mention in his letters how much he'd enjoyed the enthusiasm of the East German audiences, between the air quality and the attitudes of the people, Mayhem didn't find much to enjoy about either type of atmosphere. A quick return to Norway was required at this point so that Necrobutcher, Hellhammer, and Pella would be able to collect their welfare checks from the Norwegian government. The three left Euronymous in Munich and trooped their way back to Norway, slightly impeded by a train strike which resulted in their being forced to stay in Germany longer than anticipated. Upon arriving back in Oslo, Pella misread a letter he received from concert organizer and Rotting Christ member Sakis Tollis regarding their upcoming gigs in Athens, Greece. I just can't understand how shit-sucking dumb we could be, Pella wrote in a letter to his longtime correspondent friend Old Nick. Pella had thought the gigs had been cancelled when they had actually simply been rescheduled. So from Norway, the trio headed off to Munich to pick up Euronymous, told him the Greek dates had been cancelled, and then began what would turn out to be a hellish journey through Greece and into Turkey. During the trip, Pella kept experiencing nosebleeds on the train as a result of his severe malnutrition, and trouble didn't end when they entered Turkey. The group were stopped by custom officials who noted their collective equipment of guitars, effects pedals, and mixing board, which the authorities initially believed the band were bringing into the country to sell. Euronymous had to call the band's organizer, Arkan... I'm not even going to try. I'm not even going to try that. It's on the screen now, if you can pronounce it. Great for you. I'm butchering enough languages here as it is. I'll just continue to call him Arkan. Apologies, and let's move on. Euronymous had to call the concert's organizer from the customs office. He in turn had to fax through a signed, itemized list of all their equipment to reassure the officers that the band were indeed in Turkey on official music business. Once that came through, they were released with no further difficulties.
Move along. Move along.
And arrived at Istanbul on the 8th of December. There they were met by Yücel İnan. There they were met by Yücel, a friend of Arkan's who was happy to play host to the group. They dropped their gear off at the flat where they would sleep and spent the day and evening wandering around Istanbul, as Yücel wanted them to experience more than just a Turkish train station and bus stop. In the morning, Mayhem and their gear packed themselves into a bus and headed to Izmir. 9 long hours later, they finally arrived in the city of Izmir. Mayhem were greeted by their host, Arkan, with whom Euronymous had been exchanging letters since 1988. To help them relax after such a stressful journey, Arkan took the four to a Turkish bath so they could have a shower and get cleaned up. The bath was located in a part of Izmir that was nestled among small craftsmen, places selling stolen goods, and everybody's favorite city amenity, prostitutes. Euronymous and Necrobutcher were very talkative and excited to be on this new adventure, whereas Pella stayed quiet, not speaking much, and looking, in the words of Arkan, like a ghost. In a later interview, Arkan bemoaned the lack of modern technology which prevented him from fully capitalizing on catching Mayhem with their pants down. He jokingly said that many people would pay thousands to see Mayhem naked with only a towel around their bellies, with those classic hammam slippers on their feet. Arkan mentioned how he'd noticed the many scars Pella sported, saying that there wasn't one part of his body that didn't carry a scar of some kind. Originally intended for an outdoor venue, bad weather forced the December 9th concert indoors. At that time in Turkey, there were very stringent rules for indoor events, especially ones where adolescents were expected to attend. These rules included a predetermined ending time of between 6 and 6:30 p.m. The usual method for concerts promising multiple bands is for the supporting bands to play first to stir up the crowd and get them excited before the main headliners finally take the stage. This was not the case in Turkey. The venue owner had expected Mayhem to play first, then be followed by their supports, the Ankaran thrash metal band Hazy Hill and Izmir's very own hardcore metal band IDEA. Given the evening was presented in the European style and Mayhem were slated to play last, IDEA and Hazy Hill took advantage of the situation and both went over their allotted time frames. Because of this, Mayhem only managed to play about 3 or 4 songs before the proverbial rotting pig head hit the windmilling fan. By the time Mayhem had started playing Freezing Moon, the local cops had shown up.
They were only up for 20 minutes! What a jip!
Due to the last-minute change of the weather forcing the concert inside, the venue owner had failed to apprise Arkan of the fact that he required a permit in order to continue the event past sunset. In an interview reprinted in the Live in Zeitz booklet, Arkan claims that had he been older and had more experience with such police interactions, he could have worked things.
Yeah, I'd hate to close you down. Maybe we can reach a little, understanding here.
I understand.
But he was barely 20, and like Metallian before him, really didn't have much of an idea of what he was doing. Consequently, the police cut the power, shutting down the show. Euronymous began swearing at the police in English, demanding they turn the power back on, but there was really nothing that could be done, and the concert was ended.
Good night, Springton! There will be no encore!
Later, Euronymous remembered that in one of his letters to Arkan, he'd asked how one swore in Turkish and regretted that he'd not had the presence of mind to recall the choice phrases Arkan had transcribed for him. So horrific and scarring an event this was for the city of Izmir that it took 27 years before they welcomed their second ever Norwegian black metal band to play in 2017. That band was called Mork, and they opened their set by playing the intro of Freezing Moon as a tribute to Mayhem. Arkan said that while Pella had been quiet during their trip, when on stage he had, ironically, come to life and screamed his vocals during their short time on stage. That was the impression most strongly left in Arkan's mind, that he had come to this strange country to scream his lungs out for the true metal he believed in. The band were all set to begin their journey to the city of Ankara, where they had scheduled their second Turkish concert for December 11th, and which Mayhem had hoped would be televised. Unfortunately, the rising tensions in Iran finally exploded, resulting in the beginning of the Kuwaiti War, which featured interference from everyone's favorite busybody nation, the Americans. Big shock, right? Consequently, all transportation was immediately halted, and with no ability to get to Ankara, let alone assurance of survival, Mayhem made the wise decision to pack it in and instead anticipated a more leisurely journey across the continent to their next stop, Holland. Being as all the trains had been stopped, the band took ship for less warmongering countries to travel from, while Euronymous and Hellhammer drank away the band's meager earnings from the Izmir show. Back on dry land, Mayhem returned to their original mode of transport, the Interrail. As they traveled through Zagreb in Croatia, Per had his wallet stolen. In Belgrade, they barely managed to scrape together enough money to eat at the most healthy and classy of international eateries, good old Macca's. Wearily, the band arrived in Holland, only to discover they had arrived a day early. They tried to get a hold of organizer Bob Bacchus, but were unable to reach him as he was in the recording studio with his band Asphyx, working on their debut album. With no other options or ideas, the band collectively thought, "Fuck it!" and decided to just go back to Norway. They stopped again in Munich briefly, where Necrobutcher was able to scrape enough change together to buy 4 Snickers bars, which was the only food the 4-man band had to share during their entire trip back to Oslo. As a side note, there has been a rumor that the Holland gigs fell through due to the band being arrested. In typical internet style, this is the result of conflating 2 separate events. In 1990, Asphyx had finally received a recording contract with a German label, so they were focused on recording their album, and this is what prevented Mayhem from being able to get in contact with Bob Bacchus. In 2009, Mayhem played a show in Tilburg, Holland, then, in true rock and roll star fashion, completely trashed their hotel room. The band and their crew were arrested for causing €5,000 worth of damage to their room, with an extra €1,000 tacked on as a fine. Naturally, rumor mill gonna rumor, and internet gonna internet. The 2 stories were blended together to create a delicious bullshit smoothie, which Mayhem fans happily added to the already long list of available bullshit smoothies. I suppose at least this one doesn't have that slight long pork aftertaste. That year at Christmas, Per returned to Sweden. He stayed with his father, who showed Per a bunch of art school brochures he'd gathered in the hopes of enticing his son to return to Sweden, where he could focus on his other passion of drawing in an environment of supportive family and friends. Per did consider the idea, believing he could balance studying in Sweden while still being a member of Mayhem, and maybe even going so far as to reband Morbid.
Yeah, we're back.
And as 1991 began, it did seem as though the band were starting to drift apart as their various individual side projects began to take away more and more of their time and attention. Euronymous was working day and night on creating and promoting his new label,
Death Like Silence. Death Like Silence. Yeah, so.
Hellhammer was a highly regarded drummer who was playing in several bands as well as Mayhem, and he spent quite a bit of time at his grandmother's house in a desperate attempt to escape the toxic environment that was permeating the house at Krukstad, while Necrobutcher was off living with his girlfriend, who was pregnant with their first child. Unlike his Norwegian counterparts, Per was solely dedicated to metal and Mayhem. Mayhem the band, not Mayhem as in creating chaos and extreme disorder.
We are lords of chaos.
Euronymous had a much broader musical palette than Per, which included synth music. When Per would get frustrated with Euronymous' irritating optimism, and Euronymous would in turn become annoyed by Per's constant depression, Euronymous would blast synth music throughout the house. Per would grab a pillow and head out into the woods to try and escape the noise, only for Euronymous to march outside with a shotgun they kept in the house and start randomly shooting at birds. Apparently, Per once retaliated to this behavior by throwing a large rock at Euronymous, hitting him with bruising force in the chest, and according to one report, Per even went so far as to actually stab Euronymous, proving that he too was on his way to kill Euronymous. Hellhammer finally ran out of patience with the two of them and moved in with his grandmother permanently. Without Hellhammer there to act as mediator, the situation became even more untenable as Euronymous started goading Per.
You know there's a way out if you're so fucking depressed. One shot to the head and it's all over. No more pain.
Unfortunately, we're unable to ask Euronymous just how sincerely he meant those words. Per had spent much of his time over the previous few years writing to friends and giving interviews where he constantly talked about Mayhem's new upcoming album, which they had already written and named, Die Mysteries Dom Satanos. The band had even come up with an album cover design. However, money was tight. Per would constantly air his complaints in his letters about how expensive everything was and how little money the group had. His attitude was not allayed by Euronymous' promises of, once we get a record deal, then we will get money.
In America, first you get the sugar, then you get the power, then you get the women.
Especially as nothing seemed to be happening to make that a reality. Thus did this become yet another issue between the two, exacerbating their already tense relationship. When Easter arrived that year, Euronymous went to visit his friend and former Mayhem drummer Kjetil Mannheim, leaving Per alone in the house. On the Friday, Per bumped into Hellhammer briefly at the train station, where the drummer noted his unusually good mood, as Per excitedly showed him a new knife he'd purchased, making a point to mention to the drummer how sharp it was. Hellhammer just kind of smiled awkwardly and went about his day. On Sunday, the 7th of April, Euronymous called Necrobutcher, saying he'd tried to check on Per but had been unable to gain entry to the house due to the trio only having one key. There's that recurring theme again. Necrobutcher said he'd look in on their friend, but never got around to it. The next day, Per entered the woods armed with his new knife, sat under a tree, and slit his wrists and throat. He waited, letting his blood soak into the ground, but death didn't come. Finally, Per roused himself enough to return to the house and wrote his final letter. Excuse the blood, but I've cut up my wrists and neck. The idea was that I die in the woods, so it takes a few days before I would possibly be found. I belong in the woods and always have. There is no specific reason for this. For those who need an explanation, I am no human. This is just a dream, and soon I am going to wake up. It was cold, and the blood kept clotting all the time, plus I think the new blade is too dull. If I fail to die by the knife, I will blow the crap out of my skull. But still I do not know. I left all my lyrics at Let the Good Times Roll, plus the rest of the money. The one who finds the shit first gets it. As a last greeting, I am honored to present Life Eternal. Do whatever you want with the crap. Pella. P.S. I did not come to this now, but 17 years ago. Then Pella picked up the shotgun, sat down on his bed, placed the barrel of the gun to his forehead, and pulled the trigger. It was Monday, the 8th of April, 1991, and Pella was 22 years old. But what kind of episode of Murdered by Metal would this be if it didn't get worse? On the afternoon of April 8th, Euronymous came back to the house and once again tried to enter. Due to the aforementioned problem of not having a key and not being able to rouse Per to open the door for him, Euronymous was forced to climb a ladder on the side of the house and enter through one of the bedroom windows. The only open window was in Per's room, so he climbed in, turned around, and found himself staring at Per's body, sprawled across the bed. How long after his death Euronymous found him, I don't know. Nor do I know how long he may have stood there, shocked by what had happened. His next actions have lived in heavy metal infamy. Euronymous went back out again and purchased a disposable camera. He returned to the house and started to take photos. He then rearranged a few items, such as the shotgun and the knife, and filled up the entire roll of film. Euronymous then walked down to the nearest phone booth to make some calls, as they didn't have a phone in the house. He called Mannheim first, who says he wasn't particularly surprised when told the news, though he was of course still upset by it. The next call was to Hellhammer. Euronymous told him that
Pella's gone home.
Back to Sweden?
No, he blew his head off.
When he called Necrobutcher, Euronymous made a point of mentioning he'd taken photos. Finally, the police were called and the incident reported. A brief investigation was done which concluded the cause of death was a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head, and Per's body was removed. His room was left untouched for a few days, until Euronymous couldn't deal with the smell anymore, and asked Metallion and occultists to help decontaminate the scene, assisted by Necrobutcher, who, according to Metallion, was the only one who acted rationally. As they cleaned up, Euronymous picked out a few shards of Per's skull, some pieces of brain matter, and some of the lead shot as keepsakes. When Euronymous met up with Necrobutcher again a few days later, he handed the basis an envelope, in which Necrobutcher found the photos Euronymous had taken, which had been developed by Hellhammer. Probably a good idea on his part. You wouldn't really want to take those photos down to your local 1-hour developing store. Yeah, there was actually a time where you had to actually wait for your photos to be developed in order to see if anything you'd photographed was worth keeping. For the time when we got to use horrible, dangerous chemicals in the peace and comfort of our own home without really any federal monitoring. Necrobutcher threw the photos down in disgust, demanding Euronymous destroy them. Euronymous refused, and so Necrobutcher cut ties with him, telling Euronymous not to bother calling him until he'd burnt all of the photos. Euronymous gifted some of these photos and some of the keepsakes to various persons in the black metal world whom he deemed worthy. These include Tony Sarka of Abruptum, Robert Cabeza of Dismember, a few of the members of Samael, and Bull Metal of Massacre from Colombia. Hellhammer also got his own keepsake, a small piece of Per's skull, which he carried on a leather strap around his neck. Hellhammer thought the necklace was a nice thing which honored his friend, but it was unfortunately lost after Hellhammer engaged in some very serious headbanging at a Darkthrone party held at Fenris's home. Morgan Haakonsen of the band Marduk had spent New Year's Eve with Per in Sweden and had received a letter from the vocalist after he'd returned to Norway. Then Haakonsen heard a rumor that Per was dead, so he wrote to Mayhem and received the reply from Euronymous, saying, "Well, he just shot himself, and here's a piece of his skull. It was a shotgun, you know?" Euronymous included 2 pieces of lead and a piece of the wet brain, which Haakonsen has confirmed he still has and keeps well protected. I'm sure that's not actually wet anymore, because, time and I didn't really need to specify that, did I? Moving on, in 2018, one of the skull fragments was up for auction through the Serial Killers Inc. website, which claims to be the leading and most popular true crime collectibles company worldwide. The fragment was accompanied by a letter typed by Euronymous 5 days after Per died and was addressed to Tomas Famosi, who managed the band Tormentor. The item sold quickly for a final price of $3,500 US. The rest of the photos were eventually burned by Euronymous' father, who found the envelope while packing up his son's apartment after his murder in 1993. But back in Sweden at Vastahangening, Per's family had gathered to share their grief at the news of Per's death, causing his parents to be in the same room together for the first time in 10 years. Per's suicide note was the only item of his belongings which was sent from Norway to his family in Sweden. The family have preserved the letter, now yellowed with age and smudged along the bottom with blood. Despite being specifically asked by the family, Euronymous refused to go to the funeral. Also a prolific letter writer, though he used one of those newfangled electric typewriter machines instead of the sublime perfection of a pen. Euronymous said in a letter to a friend, "We will not attend his funeral. Dead would have hated that. His mother told us that we had to be there, but I don't give a fuck. I'm not a fucking therapist. I'm counting on that our bass player will be there, but that's because he is a sentimental wimp fucker who didn't even have the guts to see the blood." Necrobutcher was indeed the only one of Per's Norwegian friends to make the journey.
It's like I'm such a fucking softie.
Service was held at the Ustahangening Church and featured the songs Imagine by John Lennon and Sailing by Rod Stewart. At the reception afterwards, Necrobutcher found himself in the awkward position of having to try and answer the questions of family and friends whom Necrobutcher realized hadn't seen Per since he first left Sweden 3 years earlier, and who wanted to understand what had gone wrong. Per's brother Anders has said he was initially really angry at Per, enraged that his big brother had chosen to abandon his family. In an interview for a radio documentary in 2017, he said that it was so shitty of him to just take off and leave this big fucking abscess to the rest of us that just kept growing and growing as the years passed. Christmas was especially hard for the Ohlin family, as that had been the time of year that Perl would return and visit. Christmas of 1991 was brutal, no one felt good or celebratory, and it was many years before Anders felt he could celebrate Christmas again. In the years since his death, the old members of Morbid and their friends have met up with Per's brothers once a year to party and celebrate his memory. Anders visits Per's grave every month, telling his brother all about what's been happening in his life. His grave has become a place of pilgrimage for many black metal fans, and his simple tombstone, a slab of rock with his name engraved on it, and only his year of birth and death, marked with a star and a cross with which he used to sign around his name, is often decked out with fresh flowers, letters, coins, and a type of chewing tobacco Per was partial to, left as tribute to one of the greatest icons of black metal. Say it with me now. But it gets worse! In the late 90s, Anders Ohlin walked into a record store heading for the heavy metal section. He was happy and proud to see that Mayhem had their own tab, and started flipping through the albums. He stopped when he found an album whose cover he didn't recognize. He pulled the album from the stack, realizing it was a picture of Per, but it looked so weird. Then the truth of the image slammed into him, and Anders felt like he had to run out of the store because he might throw up. This was Euronymous' greatest sin, committed 2 years after the guitarist was murdered in 1993 by one Vagvikernes. Before his death, Euronymous had arranged for the release of a slightly cleaned up version of the cassette tape recording of their concert in the town of Sarpsborg, which was released in 1995 under the title The Dawn of the Black Hearts. The album was released through War Master Records, a company based in Colombia and owned by a longtime pen pal of Euronymous' nicknamed Bull Metal. Do you remember that list from earlier of all the people Euronymous had sent photos to? Yeah, Euronymous had insisted that the album's cover be the photo he'd taken of Per's body and sent to Bull Metal. 300 copies of the album were made, and it has gained the reputation as the most bootlegged album in all of metal. Though given that the album is actually technically referred to as a bootleg, wouldn't that make it the most bootlegged bootleg? This was the cover Anders was faced with that day. Had the world remained at the level of technology it was when Per died, the odds of Anders seeing that album and photo again would have been incredibly low. But the technology didn't stagnate, and no sooner had the internet been brought into people's homes than the image was, of course, uploaded. Anders has learned to be very careful when Googling his big brother. He's now able to recognize the details of the image, especially around the edges such as the wallpaper, the duvet, and the floor, so that he can look away and not have to see it. And in his later years, Anders was faced with the painful task of having to explain to his children about the photo's existence and its prevalence on the internet. Euronymous' parents gave Anders and the Ohlin family all rights to the picture after their son's death, and the family is still fighting to this day to have the image removed from the internet and stop merchandisers from selling unofficial products printed with the photo. But as we are all well aware of by now, what ends up on the internet stays on the internet.
Forever, forever, forever, forever, forever, forever.
Various platforms such as Facebook, Google, Instagram, YouTube, et al. Do nothing to prevent people posting the image online. Anders even regularly receives friend requests from people who have the image displayed prominently on their profiles. When asked, most remove the image and apologize, but too many people have lost sight of what the image shows. The culmination of 22 years of a young man's struggle with his mental health, and one family's suffering with a grief and pain that still hurts to this day. Necrobutcher also has fans routinely approach him, wearing shirts blazoned with this pirated image, asking for his autograph. And every time, Necrobutcher struggles to resist the urge to beat the shit out of him. For some fans, a Mayhem concert isn't just a concert, it's more like a traveling murder scene. In 2008, Necrobutcher tried to contact Bull Metal in Colombia to find out about the hows and whys of the Dawn of the Black Hearts cover. To no avail, unfortunately, as Bull Metal died in 2002, officially from AIDS, but many believe he committed suicide. On April 7, 2017, the exact same date that Necrobutcher had promised to check on Per but didn't back in 1991, Mayhem officially released a new copy of the live album, renamed Live in Sarpsborg, and featuring a new cover in an attempt to reclaim the album from its notoriety. During his life, Per became obsessed with subsuming himself and becoming dead. And in the 31 years since his death, he is remembered more as dead than as Per. Most videos and articles about Per focus on his near-death experience and talk about his time in Mayhem, focusing on the odd behaviors. He's been diagnosed by armchair psychologists as suffering everything from depression to schizophrenia, substance abuse, anxiety, and the admittedly fascinating Cotard's delusion, also known as walking corpse delusion. I always have to be careful with that because I just want to say walking dead delusion, but it's not walking dead, it's walking corpse delusion. While his habits were indicative of an unhealthy mental state, they weren't the be-all and end-all of who he was. Per didn't spend his whole life holed up in his room, waxing lyrical about death and decay, cutting himself and writing to people around the world. He was just a kid, a guy, a teen, a young man. He was Per for far longer than he was dead, and he lived for far more years in Sweden than he did in Norway. The Per his Swedish friends and family remember is very different from the Per his Norwegian friends knew. Mayhem fans have tried to exonerate Per's Norwegian friends and family by placing blame for his death solely upon the seemingly callous and narcissistic shoulders of Euronymous.
I'm sorry.
Euronymous did very little to dispel these rumors during the few short intervening years between his death and Per's. Many of these rumors originating from Euronymous himself. He spread the rumor that he had considered cutting off Per's arm to keep for display purposes, but decided against it after realizing that even the police would be likely to notice and ask him why Per was missing his entire fucking arm.
'Tis but a scratch.
A scratch? Your arm's off.
No, it isn't.
Well, what's that then?
I've heard worse.
You liar!
Come on, you pansy!
He claimed to have cooked up part of Per's brain into a stew and served portions to himself and the band. I find this one the most unlikely, as most 22-year-old guys I knew were barely ever to make ramen, let alone an entire stew from scratch, and while Euronymous is known for many things, I've never heard him praised for his culinary expertise. In an interview for Orkestus magazine in 1992, Euronymous said of Per's death, "Dead died because the trend people have destroyed everything for the old black metal, death metal scene. Today death metal is something normal, accepted, and funny. We hate it. It used to be spiked chains, leather, and black clothes, and this was the only thing Dead lived for, as he hated this world and everything which lives on it." Euronymous had also done nothing to quell the whispers which claimed that Per hadn't committed suicide. He had in fact been murdered by Euronymous, who had made it look like a suicide. Others have said Euronymous deliberately set Per up to commit suicide, constantly provoking him about the meaninglessness of life and the comfort of death, then purposefully leaving him alone for several days with a loaded shotgun in the house. Say what you will about Euronymous, and everyone does, but the man certainly knew how to draw attention.
Do I ever?
Die Mysterious Dom Satanus was eventually recorded between June 1992 and May 1993, but its release was delayed until 1994 due to the unexpected and sudden murder of Euronymous. The album's lineup features Euronymous on guitar, Hellhammer on drums, and the infamous Vag Vikernes on bass. Vocal duties for this album fell to Hungarian vocalist Attila Kasar, formerly of Tormentor, and Per's favorite black metal vocalist. Anders never got to see Per play with Mayhem, and his first Mayhem gig wasn't until 2009 during the band's 25th anniversary tour. While researching this video, I've come across everything from interviews with those who knew him, quotes from family, stories from friends, the constant retelling of rumor as truth, and a desire by many to make Per seem as mysterious, dark, and romantically sinister as possible, which is kind of disturbing. His exploitation from beyond the grave is continued through paranormal believers who make videos about contacting Per's spirit and conducting interviews with him. At best, I'm marginally curious as to what Per would have thought of this, had he known before his death that people would seek out his spirit to pester him with questions about whether Euronymous really did kill him, and if the afterlife had turned out to be all that he'd hoped it would. But my main purpose in creating this video was to remind people that Per was much more than just an icon of black metal. He was a son, a brother, and a friend. In the 2020 documentary Helvete, which chronicles Mayhem's early years, Per's little brother Anders has said,
Vad den har blivit är att den har blivit en kultbild då. Och problemet med det är ju att de som är fans eller skriver om musik eller sånt där tappar lite grann respekten. De ser ikonen Dead, som är hans artistnamn. De ser honom och han är död. Det är det de ser. Det jag ser är ju någonting helt annat. Jag ser min storebror och hans tragiska slut. Och det är som att jag ser allt hans lidande i en och samma bild.
If you wish to show your respect for this young man whose influence over the genre still stands to this day, don't share that cover. Instead, remember him as Necrobutcher does, happy and smiling.
Taking your own life. Interesting expression. Taking it from who? Well, once it's over, it's not you who'll miss it. Your own death is something that happens to everybody else. If your life is not your own, keep your hands off it.
Bloody hell, that was a lot, wasn't it? Thanks again for sticking with me and watching the whole video. Hope I've managed to make everyone nostalgic for those halcyon days of metal's early years, because apparently the entire world is going through a nostalgia phase right now. Some people so much so that they're starting wars over it. All resources are linked below if you want to read what family and friends have said about the cast for yourself. If you have an issue with any of the information in this video, feel free to take it up with my quality control research assistant. She helped to ensure that all my sources were credible and reliable.
I'd also like to extend a huge thanks to various members of the Mayhem subreddit and to Dark Hell from the Yngve Ohlin tribute page on Facebook for helping me separate fact from Mayhem myth.
Remember to like and subscribe. Please hit that like button with a rotting pig stick and share if you think you know someone who finds this interesting. If you do, then I promise not to mail you any rotting animals. I make no promises about pelting you with semblers, though, disgusting otherwise. Please feel free to suggest any video ideas you can't be bothered researching or creating for yourself below, and until next time, if you find your friend dead from suicide, please don't take photos of their bodies to use for an album cover. That's so mean.